On a quiet country path near Aberfeldy, Scotland, a man went out walking his dog. His name was Brian Lowe. He was 65 years old, a retired groundsman, a partner, a brother, an uncle, a grandfather, and a familiar face in a small rural community. But on the afternoon of February 16, 2024, Brian did not come home. When he was found the next morning, police first believed his death was not suspicious. A sudden medical episode, a fall, a tragic death on a lonely track. But 6 days later, the truth began to emerge. Brian Lowe had not collapsed. He had been shot. And what first looked like a quiet countryside tragedy would become one of Scotland's most disturbing rural murder cases. This is the murder of Brian Lowe. Aberfeldy is the kind of place people associate with beauty, not violence. A Perthshire town surrounded by hills, woodland, farmland, and country roads. It is quiet in the way rural Scotland can be quiet. Long stretches of road, remote tracks, places where people know each other's names, histories, and routines. Brian Lowe had lived much of his life in that world. He had worked for more than 20 years on the Edredinnet estate. He was known locally as a groundsman. Practical, steady, and well-liked by those close to him. To his family, he was not a headline. He was Brian, a man with ordinary routines, ordinary kindness, and a life that should have continued quietly into retirement. His partner, Pam Curran, had been with him for more than 2 decades. She later described him as someone everybody liked, someone without a bad bone in his body. And yet, someone had been carrying a grudge old enough to harden, quiet enough to hide, and deadly enough to end a man's life on a country lane. The last walk. On Friday, February 16, 2024, Brian went out walking his dog in the Pitilly area, near Aberfeldy. It was a familiar kind of walk, the sort of routine that should have left no mark on history. But somewhere along that remote track, Brian was ambushed. A shotgun was fired. Brian was struck and fatally wounded. He died where he fell. The next morning, at around 8:30, his body was discovered near Pitilly. At first, the scene was treated as non-suspicious. Police and emergency responders believed they were dealing with a medical incident. The countryside path was not immediately treated as the scene of a murder. Evidence that should have been protected was not secured in the way a murder scene normally would be. And for Brian's family, that mistake would become almost impossible to understand. Because Brian had not died naturally. Around 30 pellet injuries would later be identified. His death was caused by shotgun wounds. But the murder investigation did not begin immediately. It was only after further medical examination and post-mortem work that the truth became clear. Brian Lowe had been killed. The missing days. In any murder investigation, the first hours matter. The scene matters. The ground matters. Footprints, tire marks, fibers, weather, movement, contamination. But in Brian's case, those early hours were lost. Police Scotland would later acknowledge that the initial response fell short. They said policies and procedures around unexplained deaths had been reviewed. They also said they wanted to apologize personally to Brian's family. But for the people who loved Brian, no review could undo those first days. Because while police believed they were dealing with a non-suspicious death, a killer had time. Time to hide. Time to clean up. Time to remove evidence. Time to believe he might have got away with murder. Once the post-mortem revealed Brian had been shot, everything changed. Police Scotland launched a major investigation. It became known as Operation Newlane. Officers took around 1,000 statements. They visited almost 500 properties. They examined thousands of hours of CCTV. Specialists in ballistics, biology, chemistry, and cybercrime were brought into the case. But there was one major problem. The murder weapon was never found. There were no obvious eyewitnesses to the shooting. And the early handling of the scene had made an already difficult investigation even harder. So detectives had to build the case another way. The former colleague. Suspicion eventually turned toward a man named David Campbell. Campbell was a former head gamekeeper. He was in his mid-70s at the time of Brian's death. He had also worked on the Edredinnet estate, and he had known Brian Lowe. But this was not a case of two strangers crossing paths. At trial, prosecutors said Campbell had carried a long-standing resentment toward Brian. The court heard that Campbell blamed Brian for events connected to his later fall from the estate. Evidence presented in court suggested Campbell had spoken over the years about his dislike of Brian. Not a passing disagreement, not a minor workplace irritation, a grudge that had lasted for years. Campbell denied murdering Brian. But the prosecution argued that his actions before and after the shooting told a different story. The cameras. One of the most important parts of the case involved CCTV. The court heard that Campbell had disabled CCTV cameras at his home. Prosecutors said this was done to conceal his whereabouts. In a rural murder case with no clear eyewitness, that mattered. Because cameras can create timelines. They can confirm movements. They can expose lies. Or, if they are switched off, they can reveal something else. A gap. A deliberate absence. A silence where evidence should have been. Investigators also looked at movements, vehicles, possible routes, and physical traces. Reporting from the trial described evidence connected to an electric bike. Prosecutors said the bike was relevant to Campbell's movements near the time of the killing. There were also allegations around attempts to alter or remove traces that might link him to the scene. These were not pieces of evidence that shouted on their own. But together, they formed a pattern. A disabled camera. A history of hostility. A remote track. A man with knowledge of the land. And an effort, prosecutors said, to cover his tracks. The courtroom. In February 2026, David Campbell stood trial at the High Court in Glasgow. He was accused of murdering Brian Lowe. The jury heard about the shooting, the delayed discovery that Brian had been killed, the alleged grudge, the disabled CCTV, the search for evidence in a case where crucial early time had been lost. Campbell maintained his denial, but the jury found him guilty. On February 25, 2026, David Campbell was sentenced to life imprisonment. He was ordered to serve a minimum of 19 years before he could be considered for parole. The judge, Lord Scott, described the murder as carefully premeditated. He said Brian had been unarmed and defenseless. He said Campbell had not encountered Brian by chance. And he said Campbell had carried out the killing after years of bitterness. The court concluded that Brian Lowe had been targeted. The family. But a conviction does not bring a person back. For Brian's partner Pam, the loss was life-changing. She had lost the man she loved, the man she shared a home with, the man whose absence would now fill every ordinary day. In court, victim impact statements described the damage done to Brian's family. His brother Douglas spoke of profound grief, of weekly Sunday catch-ups that would never happen again, of a kind, honest man whose presence had touched many lives. The judge said Brian was clearly much loved. A partner, a brother, an uncle, a friend, a colleague, and none of that could be restored by a sentence. Brian's family also had to live with another wound, the knowledge that his murder was initially missed. In the BBC documentary on the case, family members spoke of their anger and disbelief. They could not understand how a fatal shooting had first been treated as a medical event, not because they wanted blame for the sake of blame, but because Brian deserved to be seen. He deserved for the truth of what happened to him to be recognized from the beginning. The quiet place changed. Violent crime is rare in Aberfeldy. That is part of what made Brian's murder so shocking. This was not a city street, not a late-night confrontation, not a random act in a crowded place. It was a remote country path, a dog walk, a routine, the kind of ordinary moment that people in rural communities depend on feeling safe. After Brian's death, that sense of safety was broken. Police activity stretched across the area. Searches were carried out. Local people were interviewed. CCTV was gathered from dozens of places, and for months, a community waited to know who could have done this. The answer, when it came, was not an outsider. It was someone who had known Brian. The motive. The court heard that Campbell's motive was rooted in resentment. Brian and Campbell had both been connected to the Edredonate estate. Campbell had once been head gamekeeper there. Over time, prosecutors said, Campbell came to blame Brian for events that changed his own life. What began as grievance hardened into obsession. The judge said Campbell's bitterness did not diminish. It intensified. That is one of the most chilling parts of the case. Not simply that Brian was killed, but that the reason appears to have been old anger, a private resentment nursed over years, a grudge that Brian may not have understood as a threat to his life. That is what makes targeted killings so frightening. The victim may be living an ordinary day, walking a familiar path, thinking about dinner, the weather, the dog, tomorrow, while someone else has been planning an ending. The unanswered pain. Legally, the case is no longer unsolved. David Campbell was convicted. He was sentenced. The court found him responsible. But emotionally, cases like this never feel fully closed, because Brian's family are left with questions no trial can completely answer. Why him? Why that day? Why did a grievance become murder? Why was the truth missed at first? And how do you rebuild a life after someone is taken so suddenly? Police Scotland acknowledged failings in the first response. They said lessons had been learned. But for Brian's loved ones, those lessons came after the worst thing had already happened. Brian Lowe should have returned from that walk. His dog should not have been left beside him on a country track. His partner should not have had to hear that he had been shot. His brother should not have had to sit in court and learn the details of his final moments. And a quiet Scottish community should never have had to wonder whether a killer was still moving among them. What remains? The murder of Brian Lowe is a story about violence in a place that felt safe. It is a story about an old grudge, a failed first response, a difficult investigation, and a family forced to fight through shock before they even had the full truth. But it is also a story about Brian himself, a man remembered for warmth, for honesty, for humor, for the ordinary decency that made people love him. True crime often focuses on the person who killed, but the center of this story is the man who was taken. Brian Lowe, a retired groundsman, a partner of 22 years, a brother deeply loved, a man walking his dog on a familiar path. And a life ended because someone else refused to let go of hate. On February 16, 2024, Brian Lowe went for a walk near Aberfeldy. By the next morning, he had been found dead. For days, the world did not know he had been murdered. But the truth, however delayed, eventually came out. The cameras, the lies, the history, the evidence, the courtroom, and finally, the conviction. But for Brian's family, justice is not the same as healing. Because the path where Brian died is still there. The hills are still there. The quiet is still there. And so is the absence he left behind. This was the murder of Brian Lowe.